9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of We're All Gonna Die Radio. Congratulations for making it this far. We're always pleased when we survive another week and can have an informed discussion about the world and security and some of the risks that we face. We're going to talk today about only one of the many major crises going on in the world, and that's the issue of Iran and the widely expected Israeli strike against Iran in the wake of Iran's attack against Israel now almost 2 weeks ago. To join us, we're really lucky to have two real deep experts on Iran's nuclear program and things larger about Iran. Kelsey Davenport, who is the director of Non-Proliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association in Washington, an organization near and dear to my heart. Hello, Kelsey.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Sure. And another colleague, Eric Brewer, who is the deputy vice president at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, also here in Washington, D.C., and the former deputy national intelligence officer for weapons of mass destruction. Eric, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, John. Great to see you, Kelsey.
Before we start, I have a little bit of bad news, and on We're All Gonna Die Radio, that could scare people, but it's not life-ending, although it is life-affecting. Heather Williams has been my co-host for the last many months and has had to step back from the podcast. I was going to make some joke about how the Yankees getting into the American League Championship Series and the Red Sox being sent home to play golf means that I win the podcast and she's now out. But she is incredibly busy and incredibly in demand and also has some family issues to which she must attend. So we will be inviting Heather back on as a guest. I will miss her. She's a terrific partner in crime. And I know you will miss our constant annoying arguments about the Red Sox and what is and is not a dumpling. But stay tuned. She'll join us. With that caveat, I want to start with just a couple of basics to reset the table. Israel and Iran have a long history. They have cooperated in the past, and they have been fighting proxy wars for decades. And over the last year, this is now broken out into the open. In addition, for many years, as Iran has been building up a nuclear uranium enrichment capability, Israel, under Prime Minister Netanyahu, has been very vocal in pointing out the dangers of Iran possessing this capability, have taken a number of alleged covert actions to slow down Iran's ability to produce nuclear materials. And now, in the wake of Iran's use of almost 200 ballistic missiles, several of which landed in Israel, detonated on Israeli territory, we are expecting that Israel will strike back at Iran. And the question has come up in the policy community and in the security community, is Israel likely to strike at Iran's nuclear facilities? This is a complicated issue. It has all kinds of political, security, and regional implications. And there's been a lot of, let's say, unexpert opinion thrown around widely. And so we really want to try to dig into some of the details. And because we wanted to get serious, we had Eric and Kelsey on, although it's okay to make jokes here. We all recognize this is serious stuff. But I want to start with a very basic question. And I'm going to start with Eric, since you were in the field of prognosticating and understanding these issues. A lot has changed over the last year or two as Iran has ramped up its nuclear capabilities. And really, people are left scratching their head. How far is Iran from being able to produce a nuclear weapon? And that broken down into multiple questions, right? How quickly could they produce the material and how quickly could they produce a weapon? And so, Eric, as somebody who's tracked this over the years, give us some sense on where Iran is on this nuclear landscape.
Yeah, no, great question, John. And obviously, it's one of those things that's frequently misunderstood, right? So right now, today, Iran can produce enough weapons-grade uranium for a nuclear weapon. That is kind of, the fuel that goes into a bomb. Iran can produce that very quickly. And I think actually CIA Director Burns said the other day, like, just north of 7 days, essentially, or just over a week, right? So that's very quick, obviously, right? And a lot of that has to do with the progress that Iran has made on enrichment over the last several years since the U.S. withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, right? And so Iran has mastered a whole new generation of more advanced centrifuges. It has a lot of experience operating those. It has a lot of experience operating them, producing highly enriched uranium, and so Iran has really advanced its capabilities on that front. So, but of course, Iran needs more than just fissile material to produce the nuclear bomb, right? And so it would take Iran longer once it's produced that material to actually build that device, right, and potentially put it on a missile. And we know less about that area of Iranian activity, right, because that would occur probably at military sites, at sites that are not monitored by the IAEA. But generally, the estimates are that would take Iran at least several months and perhaps a year to actually take that material and package it up and make a device. And I think it's important to note that the fissile material production, the enrichment of uranium, is the most easily detectable part of that process, right? But admittedly, that window for detection is now very narrow because of that progress that Iran has made that I mentioned a second ago. The weaponization part is harder to detect, not impossible, probably, but harder. I think that's a fair characterization. And again, that would likely take place at scattered location military sites, places where the IAEA doesn't typically monitor. And so again, that progress that Iran has made on fissile material and enrichment, that horse has largely left the barn, so to speak. On weaponization, that is, that set of activities that Iran halted in 2003 as part of its weapons program. And while I think the most recent comments by U.S. intelligence officials, they say there's no indication that Iran has turned that back on. There's been reports they have engaged in some activities that I think the term they used in some of the articles was shrink the knowledge gap with regard to weaponization. But no decision has been made on that front, which is a good thing, and that's something that I think we need to work to keep. We need to work to make sure that Iran doesn't make that decision to build nuclear weapons.
So, Kelsey, one, I want to ask you what you think of Eric's answer, because he has one opinion, and this is one where I don't think we know the answer. But also, a lot of what Eric just talked about was based on what we know and understand, based on what the International Atomic Energy Agency, the international UN organization that's tasked with inspecting these facilities. How confident are we that the IAEA at this stage has a comprehensive picture, and quite frankly, that we would know if Iran were going to make the decision and actually made the leap to go up to enough highly enriched material for a weapon?
Yeah, that's a great question, because as Eric said in his answer, Iran is much closer to nuclear weapons. I mean, they're on the threshold compared to where they have been in the past. So a few things I think are concerning about the current level of International Atomic Energy Agency access. First, I think if the IAEA would be able to detect quite quickly any move to produce weapons-grade material at Iran's declared nuclear facilities. They still have access to those facilities fairly quickly. They're still monitoring enrichment levels. So that's quite critical. But this is only a small part of the picture. I mean, since February of 2021, inspectors have not had access to some of the key facilities that support Iran's nuclear program, like the facilities where it actually produces the machines that enrich the uranium, the centrifuge production facilities. And the Director General of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, has even said that the IAEA can no longer say with confidence that it can account for all of Iran's centrifuges. So there is a real risk that Iran has diverted materials that would be relevant to developing nuclear weapons in the future, to covert facilities that could be very challenging to detect. And as Iran has mastered the ability to produce more efficient centrifuges, it needs the facilities it would need for a covert location, have a smaller footprint. They're going to be they would be more challenging to figure out where all those are. So certainly the lack of intrusive inspections raises questions about whether Iran is diverting some of these materials. To date, though, I would emphasize that the IAEA has said that there is no evidence of diversion of nuclear materials from the declared program. And that when it's conducted, its inventory assessments, the materials, line up with what the IAEA would expect to be there. But getting back to, again, just to kind of the threat and the short time it would take Iran to produce weapons grade material. I mean, one concern that arises around when Israel threatens Iran and threatens Iranian nuclear facilities is that it does give Iran justification to close its facilities to IAEA inspectors. We saw that in April after Iran's first missile strike against Israel. Concern about that retaliation caused Iran to close those facilities. The IAEA waited an additional day before sending inspectors back. So that, again, does create these gaps in monitoring that Iran could try to exploit. So certainly the concern, the lack of a more permanent IAEA presence is alarming given how close Iran is to weaponization.
No. Thank you for that. It's really helpful. I'm reminded many years ago, in the early years of the Obama administration, when there was a lot of pressure by Israel for the United States to attack Iranian nuclear facilities. I was talking with a colleague of ours, George Perkovich, who's vice president at Carnegie, and he says, I'm skeptical of the value of bombing these facilities because I'm pretty sure there's at least one guy in Iran who's been tasked with how would you rebuild this program and how would you squirrel away things that would be useful in rebuilding that program. Now, this was before we had negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which had controls and limits and monitoring over things like carbon fibers that you would use to produce centrifuges and specialized equipment. We haven't been in that agreement now since 2018. Mm-hmm. So that means that there's been 6 years where I'm pretty sure there's at least one guy in Iran who's been tasked with, okay, maybe it's a girl, tasked with how do we squirrel away what we need should Israel decide to come at us so that we could quickly rebuild these capabilities. And that's where sort of the skeptic in me wants to push both of you, which is to say, okay, Bill Burns, smart guy, knows what he's doing, been doing this a long time. He says it'll take about 7 days for them to use their existing facilities to produce enough material that could go into a weapon. I believe him. How much confidence should we have 6 years after the JCPOA fell apart because the U.S. under Trump violated it, that Iran doesn't have a covert facility? And how does this affect our ability to think about the potential Iranian nuclear challenge, right? This has always been about, can we get our arms around Iran's nuclear capabilities? And for a number of years, we had our arms around it. How do you both think about the risk now that those arms just aren't big enough to hug Iran's facilities? Let's start with Kelsey, and then I'll go to Eric.
I'm still trying to imagine hugging Iran's nuclear facilities.
I've hugged some of the facilities at Isfahan. They're nice and warm. They're very fuzzy.
Oh, fuzzy. Okay. Well, I think U.S. intelligence has a strong track record of detecting Iran's covert facilities. I mean, we saw the U.S. announced, the Fordow uranium enrichment facility. And certainly we've seen Israeli intelligence. They seem to have some strong insights into Iran's nuclear program. So I think if there was, I think the intelligence, like I said, does have a good grasp of Iran's program. And I think it would be likely to detect diversion to an undeclared site. But is it certain? I mean, that's not a probability that I would want to test. I mean, I think, again, because Iran has the capabilities, it has the knowledge, it has the expertise, there is always going to be a risk that Iran, again, has materials diverted already, or has, raw materials if it needs to reconstitute its program. And because of its advances, it can reconstitute much more quickly than it could, prior to the negotiation of the 2015 nuclear deal. So that, to me, comes back to the fact that, sabotage of Iran's facilities, strikes against Iran's facilities, this is not a viable long-term non-proliferation strategy. It might set Iran's nuclear program back, but that's likely going to be temporary because Iran can rebuild. In the past, it has rebuilt, and it has rebuilt in hardened facilities that are more difficult to target. So again, I think the U.S., the Israeli intelligence community has their arms around Iran's nuclear program. I still can't say that without laughing. And likely has a good idea of whether or not Iran is going, whether or not Iran, would sort of divert materials. But I'm not willing to kind of rest on that assertion.
This is where you make the arms are for hugging joke, Kelsey. If you remember the bumper sticker from at least my youth, if not, the old cars you saw growing up. Eric?
Yeah. Well, first, Kelsey, I really appreciate your confidence in my former colleagues in the IAEA. That's great to hear, and I share that confidence. But that's great to hear somebody say that. And no, look, I mean, I agree. There's been a lot of data points that support the idea that global intelligence organizations have pretty good insight into Iran's program, right? Including, I think, some of the more recent articles that suggest there's been some information about various potential activities with nuclear weapons applications, right? I mean, that suggests a fair degree of if those articles are right and they're accurate, suggests a fair degree of insight and information into some pretty detailed stuff, right? But I guess, I mean, to get to the big question here, John, I mean, you're the real topic of this conversation, right? I mean, I think Israel, regardless of that insight, right? I think Israel striking Iran's nuclear facilities today, absent a clear indication of Iran moving towards a nuclear weapon, would be almost the worst of all worlds in some regards, right? Because if we're right that Iran hasn't decided to build nuclear weapons, that could lead Iran to a tipping point where it actually makes that decision to leave the NPT, to kick out inspectors, and actually resolve in favor of going for a bomb. And we already know that there's public voices calling for this, or some Iranian officials have called for this. So we know there's a discussion happening there. Second, as you mentioned, as Kelsey mentioned, Iran is going to build back, right? I think this is not, the Syria case where there's a reactor out in the desert somewhere, right? This is a much more robust program. It's much more likely to be a case like Iraq, where if there's a military strike, it drives the program underground, in a way that's harder to take out. And Iran doesn't need to build back everything that's destroyed, right? It can build back in a way, per your comment, John, that there's been a person tasked with developing this plan. It can build back in a way that's more dedicated and explicit towards actually trying to get to a bomb as quickly as possible.
I know where Iran can buy a whole bunch of Build Back Better bumper stickers. I can get them for them.
Yeah,
if you're listening,
we don't want Iran to build back better, right? And so, so I think there's that factor, and finally, I would say, I am a believer that one of the reasons that the Supreme Leader hasn't decided to build a bomb today is because he's worried that this could be actually a trigger for a military strike or other severe consequences. And so this is a potential deterrent to him of going down that pathway. Now, what do we all know about deterrence, right? In order for it to work, not only do we have to make a threat credible, but we have to be able to credibly hold that threat in reserve, right? And to not take action if a country doesn't cross those red lines. And so I'm worried that by threatening to strike Iran's nuclear facilities in this very open way, or actually striking, that we are potentially creating an incentive for Iran to move towards weaponization, and giving the Supreme Leader incentive to do that.
And I was neglectful in not mentioning that Eric has an article about Iran's latency in Foreign Affairs. It's in an open tab. It's on my reading list, and I haven't gotten to it, but it is something that I'm eager to get to, because it does get to the question, right? You were just sort of raising here is like, what is in Iran's advantage? Would they need to go nuclear, right? They do have, in some ways, the best of both worlds now. People know that they could go nuclear in relatively short order, and they don't have to bear the burden of a strike. But, things are I think the diplomatic term is things are fluid in the region, and the political dynamics of Iran absorbing an Israeli nuclear strike might in some ways be very beneficial to the regime, but could also bring about greater forces that they may not be able to control. And so it is a real challenge. I want to get to one very, really narrow, geeky question before we take a very short break, which is this question of the timeline, Eric, has always sort of interested me because our friends at the CIA, okay, your friends and people I used to annoy a lot, said that, we believe that Iran abandoned its nuclear weapons development efforts in 2003, and that it didn't continue past that time. But they did work on weaponization prior to 2003, and that's been recorded in IAEA reports. That's something that I'm not revealing here a la Donald Trump, here's a classified piece of data. This is something that's been commented on for some time. So that means that Iran had some knowledge on building nuclear weapons. So why would it take them months to go from material to a bomb, right? I mean, I've listened to Frank von Hippel, one of the science geniuses in the nuclear weapons world, talk about how a terrorist could make a uranium bomb in a cave pretty easily if they could get the material. So what are the delay factors here? What are the hurdles that Iran still needs to cross as you understand them and can talk about publicly?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, John, right? And this is a lot of this depends on so many variables, right? It not only depends on, what what work Iran has or hasn't accomplished. It depends on how quickly they want to do it. It depends on, how confident they are. It depends how much pressure they're under. It depends on, and you can look at how other countries have navigated these same types of tasks, right? Iraq in its crashed nuclear weapons program, right? It's subject to a whole range of internal, political, bureaucratic, external factors that it's really hard to estimate precisely how long that's going to take, right? You talked about the Iran halting this nuclear weapons program in 2003. And I think since then there's also been, you look at a lot of the reports that have come out of the State Department, the IAEA, some of the testimony that's been given over time by the intelligence community talks about how Iran has, engaged in some dual use activities, right, over time, and now we have these reports about closing knowledge gaps, etc. I think of it as I think a good analogy in this is, if Iran was under the previous weapons program was trying to, if it was analogous to a race, right, and Iran was, preparing, it was sprinting, it was doing everything it could to try and run this race where at the end is the bomb, and Iran stopped all of that, and hung up its cleats, tore down the track that it was practicing at, and fired all the athletes or made them go do other things. There's just the question of how much has Iran held on to those skills and capabilities, right? And how much has it maybe hasn't run a real race, but maybe it's practiced somewhere, or maybe it's thought about how to buy the cleats again, or there's all sorts of things that it could potentially do that doesn't really enable it to do that any faster, but is not entirely irrelevant, right? And so
Right.
I think that's one way that I've tried to think about it.
Okay. Kelsey, what has the IAEA said about their ability to detect weaponization activities? Because as Eric said before, and as we all know, this is stuff that could go on in a closet, right? I mean, just sort of thinking about drawing designs, very basics. We're not talking about like a advanced nuclear weapon design that has to sit on a missile for years at a time and still be reliable. We're talking about, if they really needed to put something together under duress. Has the IAEA talked about its ability to detect and understand? And what's your sense on whether Iran might be doing this without detection?
Well, the IAEA is really limited by its mandate to just looking at the fissile material production and tracking those materials. I mean, one of the great things about the 2015 nuclear deal was that it gave the IAEA additional authorities and tools to look at some of the critical weaponization related activities. But the IAEA has not been able to implement that aspect of the agreement now for several years. However, I think, as we've seen, Western intelligence agencies in particular are very good at sharing information, with the IAEA. So if there was a concern about weaponization, I think there would be a lot of communication between the agency, and Western governments in particular, to try to understand, what that intelligence was saying about Iran's nuclear activities. But again, the critical point here is that the windows are so small. When you're talking about being able to produce enough weapons grade material, in a week or less, the ability to take the time to analyze, to understand, to properly assess and ensure that you're not, responding to, a miscalculation or an accidental enrichment spike, in Iran. Given that those timeframes are so short, I think there still is a real risk of miscalculation.
Look, this is normally where we take a break, but this is a really valuable discussion. So David Rothkopf will be mad at me. Go to deepstate.org or DSR Network and pay us some money, and you'll be able to hear lots of other cool stuff in the future. But we're going to continue this conversation as it's going now. And I really want to get to the crux of the matter here, which is when asked whether Israel should attack Iran's nuclear facilities, Joe Biden said no. Donald Trump said, why wouldn't you want to go after the nuclear facilities? Those are the ones you want to hit. So I'm going to guess that both of you think attacking Iran nuclear facilities is not such a great idea, but I want you to sort of concisely explain why you think it's a bad idea. And then we're going to get to what happens if Israel decides to do this anyway. So Kelsey, I want to start with you.
Sure. So I would raise a few points against attacking Iran's nuclear facility. First, from just a technical perspective, it'd be very challenging to do. Iran has dispersed its facilities. It has hardened a number of those facilities that would make it, very difficult for, Israel to destroy unilaterally, particularly, certainly if the United States supported Israel, we could do some more damage. But just again, from that just technical perspective, it would be challenging. But I think more importantly, and Eric got into this a little bit earlier, is what does an attack drive Iran to do? In addition to the technical capabilities we've seen Iran develop over the last few years, the discussion in Iran about its nuclear doctrine is also shifting. And increasingly, we're seeing officials, a group of lawmakers even this week, suggesting that Iran actually needs nuclear weapons now. And this is coming from a country that, for years denied that it ever had an illicit nuclear weapons program. So there's much more open discussion about the deterrent value of nuclear weapons. So I think, a strike is going to only strengthen those voices, within Iran. And there's going to be much more of a risk of Iran withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, whether or not it decides to pursue nuclear weapons. And then you have a situation where the international community's ability to respond is going to be weakened because pursuing weapons will no longer be illegal for Iran. So I think, again, just the challenges of succeeding, the risk of pushing Iran closer to nuclear weapons, to me, just again underscores that strikes against the program are not a viable non-proliferation strategy. It's not going to change the cost-benefit analysis in Iran. And if anything, it's only going to push Tehran closer to the bomb. So I'm firmly in that this is not a good idea camp.
Other than that, though, you think it's a great idea. Eric, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah, there's not much to add. I would draw one small distinction, right? You could see a world in which we had solid evidence that Iran was in the midst of a dash to a nuclear weapon, right? Like it was going for 90%, it was doing the breakout. And then the United States would have real tough decisions to make about what action to take. And because of all the reasons that Kelsey's already talked about, not a lot of time for diplomacy in that scenario, right? Because we're talking days until they have enough fissile material. Much longer for a bomb, but days until fissile material. And so the United States would have real tough decisions to make in that scenario about whether or not a military strike made sense. Now, you're not going to eliminate the program. At best, you're going to disrupt it and set it back. In that scenario, I think there's some tough choices to be made. And the United States and President Biden has said he's not going to allow Iran to get nuclear weapons. Every United States president has said that for both parties. But that's not the world we're in thankfully, right? Iran isn't dashing to a nuclear weapon. It's not producing 90%. Supreme Leader Khamenei hasn't made a decision to produce nuclear weapons, and the weapons program hasn't resumed. So, yes, it does not make sense to strike Iran's nuclear program right now at all, for all of the reasons Kelsey has mentioned, that I mentioned earlier. This is from the consequences of Iran leaving the NPT, deciding to produce nuclear weapons, building back in a way that's harder to get at. And then I think I would add too, even though it's Iran, it can build back faster now than it has in the past. There's a big question, right, about even if Israel, which is widely believed not to have as an effective capability as the United States when it comes to targeting Israel's facilities, even if Israel's able to effectively target like Natanz and Fordow, the two underground enrichment sites in Iran, right? Iran has a lot of centrifuges now, probably in storage, right? More than it did before. Is the strike going to destroy those as well? If not, that's a lot of capability left over. Iran has a lot of 60% and 20% enriched uranium that it can use to enrich to weapons grade much faster than the 3.67% or the 3.5%. Is the strike going to destroy those stockpiles as well? If not, it's a lot easier for Iran to build back faster, right? And so I think all of these things matter a lot when evaluating whether or not that type of strike makes sense.
Yeah. I think you put your finger on a really important distinction, which is because Iran is not seen as sprinting for a bomb, the U.S. doesn't have to answer the really, really tough question.
Right.
We wanted to avoid that situation in the extreme. And as you said, deterrence is about the withholding of a threat as much as it is the credibility to impose it. I'm also just struck. There's a great quote. One of Kissinger's aides recommended attacking Chinese nuclear facilities to slow down their program. He said that's a great idea. How often do you intend to do that? Right. I mean, because there is a threshold and knowledge question, which at a certain point you just can't create. It's almost as if withdrawing from the JCPOA was not a great idea, but that's what we're supposed to be forward looking. We're not supposed to be, we're not supposed to be casting blame on people that do incredibly stupid things. I want to thank you both for providing some light into this discussion. People are going to yell at each other both ways. If you don't attack nuclear weapons facilities in Israel, in Iran, you're weak and you just want to encourage the Ayatollahs. And if you do, you're a warmonger. And actually, as we've seen in this discussion, it's an incredibly complex and nuanced issue. Just because you decide to make the decision to resort to military force doesn't mean that problem goes away. And history has shown us that it actually can become much more complicated. So I hope we never have to have you on again. I'm pretty sure we will have to. And in fact, we might even do it once Israel figures out what it's going to do with Iran. And we might be able to discern a little bit of information about what that indicates about the future. So for now, let me just say thank you all for joining us. You've survived another episode of We're All Gonna Die Radio. So congratulations. Kelsey, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Eric, thanks so much. Really appreciate your time and efforts.
Thank you, John.
And we'll be back again next week, the good Lord willing. In the meantime, take care of yourselves, and thanks for listening.